Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Using the IEP to Bridge the Gap to Employment, hosted by Peak Parent Center's Project Power, which is an RSA-funded transition technical assistance project. We're excited to have a great panel of presenters, including a parent and professionals all involved with different aspects of transition from high school. And in honor of Disability Employment Awareness Month, we hope you will gain some practical information on using the IEP to improve student outcomes and to increase access to employment. We ask that you remain muted for the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat feature, and we'll try to get those at the end if there is time. We will end right at 2 o'clock, if not before. If you need closed captioning, the live transcript can be accessed at the bottom of your screen using the closed captioning icon, or CC. Following the presentation, you will receive an email with an evaluation. We would appreciate if you would take just a minute to complete that and provide your feedback. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer Stewart.
Great, thanks, Anne. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. As Anne said, our presentation today is put on by a nice team of us here in Colorado, and we're going to be talking about how you can use the IEP to help bridge the gap to employment. So to start us off, let's just do quick introductions. My name is Jennifer Stewart. I own my own business called Breaking Expectations LLC, and I'm involved in several different transition-related projects here in Colorado. And I am here with my colleague, Gail. I'll let you introduce yourself, Gail.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gail Lott, and I work as a secondary transition specialist for the Colorado Department of Education, supporting secondary transition teams in effective transition planning processes. Jen?
Hi, my name is Jen Mendenhall, and I am a parent of a 16-year-old girl with cerebral palsy. Her name is Codi. And so we are just in the mid part of our transition processes. I'm also a parent member of the State Rehabilitation Council and have worked with a lot of other different local and statewide transition service projects as well.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Barrows. I'm a transition consultant here in Colorado, was a longtime special education director in Colorado, and now supporting Mesa School District 51 in Grand Junction, Colorado as a transition consultant.
Great, thank you, everybody. So just real quick, let me review sort of our agenda for today. We're going to hear from Gail Lott from the Department of Education. She's going to talk about really how do we prepare for an IEP meeting and what does that process look like? I'm going to speak towards the importance of when we're talking about incorporating employment into the IEP process, how important that student's vision is, and some different ideas around how to truly get at that and understanding that it's also a process. Bob is going to speak to how important school partnerships are with the school district to support employment, especially during those high school years, but as you're getting ready to prepare for that exit. And then we're going to wrap up with hearing from Jen and her own personal story on this transition journey for Codi heading towards employment. So what we really hope that you take away from today, just in terms of those objectives, is number one, really understanding the importance of preparation for an IEP meeting. So what you can do beforehand, and then what does that process sort of look like? We want you to walk away and understand the importance of advocacy around that student's vision, right? And understanding that it's really important that it reflects their strengths, interests, and preferences. And then lastly, we want you to have a good understanding of how schools can truly partner to better coordinate those school and community resources. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Gail so she can speak to the importance of preparing for an IEP meeting.
Okay, I'm ready. So what's really important about the transition planning process is really we are beginning with the end in mind. we are starting with a clear understanding of a student's destination. And so that is really the purpose of all of the transition assessment that we do. We're trying to figure out the student's destination, their post-secondary goals. And so it means to know where you are going so that you better understand where you are now, so that the steps you take are always in the right direction. And so really, that's what the planning process is about, making sure we are taking steps in the right direction. Okay, Jen. So I always like to ground ourselves in the requirements around secondary transition planning and the purpose of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And so the purpose of the work that we are doing is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And so that is our ultimate goal. We want our students to exit our K-12 system ready to be successful in competitive integrated employment, for further education outcomes, and then to live as independently as possible as adults. Next slide, please. So what is the Individualized Education Program, or that IEP that we talk about so much? So it is a written legal document. School districts are held accountable for the information that is in that plan. They are held accountable for the services that are detailed and outlined in that plan. But more than that, it is a map. It really lays out the program of specialized instruction. So what specialized instruction does that student need in order to meet their goals? What are the supports that need to be in place? And what are the services that the students need to have in order to make progress and to thrive in school and to be successful as adults? So having an IEP gives students, families, and schools legal protections too. And so it really is important that families are involved in the decisions that impact their child's education. And so family involvement is critical in this process. And IEPs are part of the K-12 public education system. Next slide, please. So really, when a student becomes transition age, and in Colorado, it is age 15 or by the end of the 9th grade, there are really 8 required elements of a secondary transition IEP that need to be added as part of that process. And so we need to make sure that there are appropriate measurable post-secondary goals within that IEP. And those goals have to be updated annually. So we have to reconsider whether we are on that right path. Do we need to update that goal and change the student's path? So that plan needs to be based on age-appropriate transition assessment. So we are continuing to assess all throughout the school year, continuing to gather information about a student's strengths, interests, needs, and preferences, and making sure that the plan that we are developing aligns with that. And then helping us to identify what those services are. What are those activities that the student needs to be engaged in order to be successful? That plan needs to include courses of study. Those courses of study really are the places where those classes where those students will gain the skills that they need that will reasonably enable the student to meet their post-secondary goals. And then that transition IEP also needs to have annual IEP goals related to those, the students' transition services needs. And so, what are the skills that are going to be worked on that have been identified through the transition assessment process, and how are we going to close those achievement gaps so that the student can be successful? There also must be evidence that the student was invited to the IEP meeting where transition services are going to be discussed. And then there needs to be evidence, if that is appropriate, if an agency is going to be invited to that meeting, Then there must be evidence that the family has given prior consent, or the student who has reached maximum age of majority have given consent for that agency to be invited. So these are the 8 required elements that are outlined in IDEA that are a part of the transition planning process. Next slide, please. So within those IEP meetings, it's really a time for a team of folks to come together, an interagency team to come together to develop a plan that will enable the student to be successful. That will enable the student to meet their post-school goals in these 3 areas. And so when that plan is being developed, there must be a post-secondary goal in the area of education and training and career employment. Those are required by IDEA. There will also be goals around independent living and independent living skills development if the transition assessment determines that there is a need for such a post-secondary goal. Next slide, please. So within that IEP meeting, that team is going to be discussing what kind of services the student might need. And these services are really going to help that student move from school to post-secondary activities and post-secondary success. And so what are those services that the student may need, and who needs to be at the table and who needs to be providing that service to the student? And so around the area of post-secondary education, who needs to be providing a service and preparing students and connecting students to that someone in that college environment or that disability services office? Who needs to be involved around the vocational education piece and the integrated employment piece, including supported employment? So what are those services to assist the student? What are those adult services? What are those independent living services or community participation that need to be a part of the student's IEP so that that student can be successful? Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about who should be included in that meeting, at the center of this whole process is the student. And so this really should be a student-focused, student-centered planning process, taking into consideration the student's strengths, interests, needs, and preferences. Every student should have a voice within that IEP meeting and be active participants. And their needs to be considered, their needs need to be considered. So we have our folks on the K-12 education side, which could include a general ed teacher. We need someone in that meeting who is familiar with the general education setting and requirements in the general education setting. We need the special educator there. We may need someone from and another administrator there, or a related service provider there if that student is receiving OT or PT services. So whoever needs to be at the table that meets the student's needs to prepare them for post-secondary. Also, family members need to be a part of that meeting. And then any community or agency service providers that need to be there. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about how parents and students can prepare for the meeting, really when the parent shows up at the meeting, it would be good if the parent or the adult or guardian is able to really talk about what their child's interests and preferences are and share where they would like their child to work. What's the parent's vision for what life should be like for their student when they graduate? Will their student be competitively employed, or will they need supported employment? So what are the expectations of the family? Because research says that the higher the family's expectations are for a student, usually the more successful they are. So will post-secondary education or training be needed? Where will their child live and what supports will be needed? And how will transportation needs be met? transportation is usually a really a barrier for students once they exit the K-12 system. And what supports will their child need in order to live the life that they want? And so these are some of the questions that parents may come to the meeting, prepared to answer and provide feedback. Another thing that families could do is to prepare their child to participate in the IEP meeting. How might they practice with their child in sharing their needs? Students should be able to share with their needs, their wants. What is their vision for their life? What would they like to do? What are their strengths and weaknesses? So families can help their child to participate in those IEP meetings by helping those students learn to answer those questions. Next slide, please. This is one of the slides that I saw at a conference many, many years ago. And so it really speaks to the percentage of time that different people have speak within an IEP meeting. And if you notice from this illustration, students usually speak the least amount of time. And even today, a lot of times students speak the least amount of time within their meeting, a meeting that is all about them. So one consideration, how can we get students more involved in leading their own meetings? How can we get them more involved in being self-determined and making choices about their life? And how can we get them more involved in advocating for what they want and what they need? Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you, Gail.
Okay.
Yeah, that leads really nicely just into more discussion really around the importance of a student's vision, as this is really going to drive the development of that post-secondary vision and goal, which then leads to developing those annual IEP goals, which helps us figure out the services, resources, and supports that a student needs. So I just want a couple slides to really highlight the importance of focusing on how do we really think about supporting a young student in developing sort of that post-secondary vision. So when we're talking about a post-secondary vision, this is really a plan for life after high school. So this is not something where they say, I want to go work and I want to work in the ice cream shop, which is maybe something they could do currently. So we really want to think about, well, what is something that maybe isn't attainable right now that you want to do after high school, right? And it's kind of within those buckets of both career and employment, education and training, and independent living. And we want to really think about a post-secondary vision as truly, this is their dream for the future. Couple key points here that we want to highlight. A lot of work we're doing in Colorado right now is we're really trying to talk about having those high expectations, which Gail spoke to, both family and teacher expectations related to what's possible for a student greatly impact sort of their post-secondary success, but also impact the services that they have access to. So we want in general to raise the expectations of what's possible during the high school years, right? So along with high expectations, we are really focused on when do we start having these conversations? And that it's not just about high school. Yes, technically transition services start at age 15, but when do we start having those conversations about, well, what is it that you want to do in your future? So really sort of making sure that we're having those at a young age and we're having them frequently, and understanding that their response is going to change. We want the vision and response to change because they should have different experiences that expose them to either liking something more or also figuring out quickly, oh, maybe that's not the right fit for me. So when I speak about this, it's really about a process, right? Kind of we make one decision and then we go back, right? So I have all of these bubbles on here about how creating a vision can be fun, it can be stressful, it's an opportunity to be creative. It's really about exploration, personalized and individualized in every secondary vision, post-secondary vision for our students when we're looking at IEPs really should look different, right? So that's one of the things also for working in the education system. We want to make sure that you're not seeing similar services, similar annual IEP goals, similar visions. This should be very individualized. One of the things we want to talk about is that while developing a vision and developing annual IEP goals as a part of the IEP process, it's really important when we have other people around the table to go beyond that and really have that bigger picture transition planning, right? So we say that failure to plan is planning to fail. And we have some tools that we're really sort of sharing with our educators, our families here in Colorado. Just a couple to name a few. We're doing some training right now around charting the life course, which have some great tools around person-centered planning, both for families to use, professionals to use. So that is a great thing. You can Google it, charting life course, foundational tools for person-centered planning. Another tool comes out of Transcend, and it's called the Positive Personal Profile. Also a nice exercise and tool to do both with families and students to help really explore who that individual is and what it is that they're thinking about, big picture for their future. So just a couple things when we talk about vision, right? Whenever vision comes up, there's two questions, right? One is, well, what if there's no clear vision? And the other one is, well, what if the vision is unattainable? So I'm going to speak about both of those points and maybe give a few ideas when it comes to, especially to work, how we can be thinking about this differently. So if there's no clear vision, that's perfect. That's okay, right? The whole high school years and younger are an opportunity for us to really be providing these different experiences where we can then assess interests and preferences. So if there's not really something clear, we can start out with an exercise, do some self-reflection from the student that maybe gives us the answer of how we can get a little bit clearer in moving forward, right? So there's a lot of transition assessments out there. Just want to highlight when it does come to work-based learning and putting students in different experiences, whether it's informational interviews, job shadowing opportunities, making sure that we do have student reflection incorporated into getting that feedback loop and then making some changes moving forward is one of the most powerful tools when it comes to work-based learning. Of course, we can ask other individuals, right? So that's a part of sort of that team around the IEP table. If the student doesn't have a strong voice or much self-advocacy or clarity around their vision, who are some other partners around the table, whether it's family members, community members, or within the school system that can help sort of play on what are their strengths and maybe help set up some next steps for a work experience to explore something that they might be interested in. And then, of course, the last bullet here is, of course, don't panic because visions are going to continually change, right? We should never see that post-secondary vision potentially being the same on every year because something is going to narrow down. Maybe we get a little bit more clarity. Maybe originally if somebody wants to be a computer scientist and then they realize the next year because of the experiences that happened throughout that school year that they narrow it down to a different section that is just more around, you know, computer analytics or something like that. So again, so this is discussed annually at the IEP meeting, but really this should be an ongoing conversation throughout the year as to how sort of those hopes, desires, and dreams are changing because of the work experiences we're providing for students. And then, of course, there's the possibility that a student, when you say, well, what is it that you want to be, you know, after school, what is your vision, your dream for the future? It's possible that it might not be attainable, or at least from somebody else's perspective, they don't think that's necessarily something that's realistic. So sort of the advice around this one would be the importance of really respecting every vision and really to see the vision as the start of an exploration, right? So understanding that it's okay if it's not attainable in present day, it shouldn't be, because a vision is a plan for life in the future after school. And so really this allows us an opportunity to identify, okay, well, what are the skills that we get to practice to help them move towards this? And so really allowing that to, as an opportunity to be creative around your employment experiences that take place Again, there's a couple different, and sorry I didn't put it in this presentation, but great graphics around work-based learning continuums, right? That really sort of start out as supporting students to increase their awareness around work opportunities, moving into exploration type, more hands-on, and then really moving towards that competitive integrated employment. So, and Bob and Jen might even be able to speak to that a little bit more as to what they're seeing. So just to sort of wrap this up, when I speak about vision and when I think about supporting students in the transition process, I like this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that just says, you don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. So let's hear from Bob, and he can speak to a little bit more about what this looks like for schools actually partnering around employment.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Let's go right to the top 10 ways that schools can support students with their employment goals. And number one is capturing the student's vision, just as Jennifer was talking about. That is absolutely the most critical place to begin. Number two, ensuring that post-secondary goals capture that current vision. Jennifer was talking about, students changing their mind in high school, and that happens all the time. And we need to be revising post-secondary goals as those interests change. I think in my experience, I've seen a lot of times where what the goal is on the paper isn't what the student is most interested in, a month later or 3 months later. So it's important to revise goals as interests change. And that's number three. I think sometimes IEP teams get a little lackadaisical in that way. They see it as too much work to revise an IEP when a student changes that interest. But it's important to be staying up to date on where that vision is for the student. Number four, providing vocational assessments in a variety of ways. There's a plethora of transition assessments out there that can capture vocational interests. And the key is really not to just rely on the same one or two transition assessments and use them for all the students on a case manager's caseload. You really want to have assessments, like some assessments are computer-based, and that works really good for some students, but doesn't work good for others. Other assessments will use multiple raters of different categories on the assessment. In other words, the student gets to, rate themselves on how they are doing certain things, but then the parent sometimes in other assessments has a version where they can have their opinions into that assessment as well. A case manager may have an opinion too. So assessments that use more than just one rater on different elements is really important to look at, and then calibrating those assessment results. Number five, providing work-based learning experiences. This concept can include virtual job shadows in the classroom or video explanations of jobs. The idea is to get the student to really think about themselves performing a job in a variety of ways. In its simplest form, it's, would you rather work inside or would you rather work outside in the elements? Would you rather work with a lot of people or not around very many people? So it can be pretty simple in that concept too. Next slide. Utilizing the School to Work Alliance program, that's a thing in Colorado that is popular. And in many school districts in Colorado have this School to Work Alliance program or SWAP program. And these specialists are funded in part by the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, or DVR. And when SWAP staff collaborate with DVR counselors, they provide a really rich support structure for students with disabilities beginning as early as age 15. This support is focused on job skills, job readiness, resume writing, preparing for job interviews, and attending local job fairs, all those kinds of things we see from our School to Work Alliance program that really supports this whole process. Providing work experiences and internships during the school day. The key here is to create ways for students to participate in work-based learning experiences outside of school during the school day as part of their schedule. And in Colorado, we have examples of school districts that have figured out how to make that happen. Number eight, utilize supports from DVR. As mentioned a minute ago, this is something that goes with our SWAP program, but DVR can be related and supported to students without that SWAP connection. So the key is to figure out what is that path to DVR in the community or in the state that you live in, so we can get ongoing DVR support for students that can continue even after high school up to the age of 24. So DVR is a critical player in these achieving employment goals. Number 9, creating pathways for students to receive graduation credits for work experiences. And some school districts have figured that out. They figured out how to give perhaps elective credit or graduation credit for those work-based experiences, whether they're unpaid internships, paid internships, or even students that have gained paid employment. How can we award some credit to students that are out there doing those kinds of things? And number 10, form partnerships and agreements with community agencies and businesses. In Colorado, we've seen some high schools form really dynamic relationships with local businesses, and they create a win-win, that puts a student in a position to have a really legitimate experience at a job, but might be filling an unmet need for an employer at the same time. So creating that win-win for these partnerships is really important. Next slide, please. Let's talk about community partnerships opening the doors of possibilities. The interagency team between school district and local agencies, this is a big unmet need in Colorado. And I think it was such a big need in Colorado that our state leaders at like Gail, who just spoke, who's a leader at the Colorado Department of Education, our Colorado Office of Employment First, DVR, Healthcare Policy and Finance, all of those guys got together and, created a project called Sequencing of Services here in Colorado. And it was piloted in 4 school districts last year. And I was fortunate enough to be in one of those districts. And that project, Sequencing of Services, provided a roadmap for the bonding of the school district with community agencies to focus on transition planning for students with disabilities. So we're in our 2nd year of that project in Mesa County right now, and really focus on coordinated student planning right now. How do we involve all of these players at the table to really do some quality planning? Number 2, community center boards open the gateway to waivers. The key here is to reach out and understand, how does that community center board operate, and support families to apply for children's waivers, disability waivers, adult waivers. That's a difficult landscape to figure out. And in many districts in Colorado, parents of students with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are not aware. They're not aware of what these disability waivers can provide. They're not aware of what a community center board is. In my experiences last spring in the district I'm working with, I'm educating parents that had students as old as 18, 19, 20 years old. They did not have that information about community center board and disability waivers. So it's really important to support our parents in navigating that landscape. That's number 4. We've got to really figure out, how do we do that in each community? Let's go to number 5, create ongoing and sustainable partnerships, through agreements. In the district I'm working in right now, we're doing exactly that. We have a meeting tomorrow. We're going to ratify a memorandum of understanding for our interagency team. And really the sad part about that is around 10 years ago, that community had an agreement and it just fizzled out over time. So we didn't have a sustainable agreement that was going to withstand time. And that's really important, is to figure out, how can we get these players to the table, have an agreement that's really going to last. Let's go to reach out to program approved service agencies, or PASAs, and include them on the team. When school districts reach out to service agencies, they really open the door to collaboration about how our young adults can be served by these agencies, even when they're going to be an ongoing adult. So that old saying of, the last day that this child's in the school district, the last day in their school district should really mirror their first day in ongoing adult services or ongoing adult supports. So how do you bring those two, points in time together so that there's no gap when a student ages out of the school district or leaves the school district? And that's really the focus of a lot of the work that we're doing on is we need to get that ongoing adult scene figured out. Who are the agency providers going to be? What is the waiver that's going to support those ongoing adults? So that's really important. Define the service that each agency provides and communicate it to the community through this sequencing of services project that we were on. That's a hot topic. You know, it's like, how do you define what each agency provides? And how do you make it available to parents, whether that's an online directory or a public-facing tool where a parent can go and scan through all of their local agencies to see what they all provide, because at some point it's going to be incumbent on them to make those decisions with their young adult. So getting that figured out is really important and a critical part of that interagency team. Clearly defining for school-based staff how to ensure that agency linkages are invited to the IEP. You know, this is a big growth area in the district I'm in. It's been a big growth area in many of the districts that I've been in that case managers just don't know. They don't know what agencies their kids are related to or they're getting services from. They don't ask the question. They don't take the time to try to figure that out. And therefore, those agencies and school districts are kind of like two ships passing in the night. You know, the IEP goes on, and if we don't have, even though it's a federal requirement that you include agency linkages, I think a lot of districts across the country just don't do a good job of understanding that, figuring that out, and asking the question. So clearly defining that, how are we going to ensure that agency linkages are there? And then once those positive relationships are formed, you know, how do we begin the conversation about how to braid funding for services? This is another big growth area and sometimes a contentious one for some community center boards in Colorado anyway, that see their supports of students only starting when students have exited the educational system. You know, on the contrary, in some communities, there's a rich conversation about how funding can be shared for various supports, especially during the 18 to 21 years of age in post-secondary programs or transition programs in school districts. How are we figuring out how to share funding, share resources, and it doesn't have to be a contentious topic. Next slide, please. So, you know, how does all these things work? You know, I think the staff and the time is really the most critical question. You know, how do you have dedicated school-based staff that actually have time to think about all of these things for improving transition services? If you're expecting somebody that has a caseload of 20 or 30 students and they're managing all of those IEPs and they're teaching all day and they're running all of that, they are not going to be the person that is really going to have the time to get out there and figure out a lot of these elements, you know. So transition coordinators, other consultants, other kinds of people that can have uninterrupted time to really dive into this is really important. Otherwise, I think a lot of school-based folks are just not going to have time to dive into this like they need to. And community outreach, you know, when anybody from the school district reaches out to community partners, you know, we're talking about how to strengthen relationships, communication, and trust. In my role as a transition consultant, I've been able to really do exclusively that in the community that I work in. And I tell you, every agency that I've reached out to, almost every one of them was like, thank you so much. We want to be a part of this. We want to improve this communication. We want to be a part of planning of these students. And so just getting that outreach going is not a difficult thing if you have allocated staff that have time to do that work. Family engagement, you know, parents need to get help. They need support. A lot of the parents that, especially parents of students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are overwhelmed. They are just trying to manage the day in and the day out. And they really need school-based people to help them navigate that, about how to apply for waivers, how to get connected to their community center board, how to get connected to DVR. So we need to be providing supports to parents so that we get that symbiotic path to adulthood with no gaps. There's just going to be right into that ongoing adult world. So those are the things that, we like to talk about in our community right now. It's been a fun last year and a half. And the projects we're on right now promote all of these things. And we're excited to see them come to fruition over these next few months. So now I'll turn it over to Jen, who can give us the real scoop on what it's like to raise a child and have them navigate all of this.
Thanks, Bob. Oh my gosh, the real scoop. I could talk for hours about that, but let's go to the next slide, please. So this is my daughter, Codi. She is 16 and she is in 10th grade. She goes to Grand River Academy, which is an online school, and she's in their SSN program, which has been a wonderful school situation for us the last about a year now. Just a bit about Codi. We had a really rough birth, and which resulted in hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which basically means lack of oxygen to her brain. Eventually, she had a diagnosis of cerebral palsy and epilepsy. As you can see here in the picture, she does motor around in her pink and purple wheelchair. She has amblyopia in one eye, so she's not able to see out of her left eye very well. Her brain and her right eye have kind of compensated for that. She has a gastrostomy tube, which gets her pretty much 99% of her food, although she does eat some by mouth. She is considered nonverbal and uses a communication device for her, not only her schoolwork, but also for her to be able to communicate with others. So I'm giving you this background because this is very relevant with her IEPs and how people represent her and how they actually see who she is. We had a counselor one time as we were transitioning from 5th grade into 6th grade, which is the middle school here in our community. And he couldn't believe it when he met Codi. And he's like, this is the same girl that I just read about in her IEP. So my first thought about when you have a child with an IEP and you're wanting to work for future goals or even their in-school goals is looking, so there's so much more than what they're written on paper. So that's just a little bit about Codi. As you can see, she has a pretty dynamic smile and she definitely enjoys her life. So her IEPs, I had no idea what an IEP was. Luckily, my dad had been a high school teacher and principal and had worked with the SSN kids in his school. So he kind of would come to our IEP meetings and kind of help direct me until we got out of elementary school. So it was really good to have his input and being able to say, hey, you have the power to be able to lead these IEPs and be able to give people on your team the information that they need about Codi. I always wanted to be very proactive in her IEP meetings. I would either bring in a picture of Codi and sit it on the desk so everybody could see that, or I would make slideshows so that they could see who she was beyond that piece of paper and beyond whom they saw in the classroom. And then Codi started actually participating in her own IEPs probably in about 4th grade. So that was really good to get her included in that and her opinions. She was kind of shy about it at first, although shy is not necessarily a word I would continue to use to describe her because she is a very social person. In her IEPs, I always felt it was very important to have her community-based representatives, the people that are working for their plan of care for her Medicaid waiver. I also really often fought to have her paras there because she has a one-on-one para, and they are the ones that are with her the most time throughout the day. And we did come up with some hesitation from the school districts on that, but we tried to get them in there or at least have some sort of a written paper for them to report on what her school was like. So then things kind of got a little bit weird as she transitioned into 6th grade. She was going into middle school. And then, of course, COVID came along. So we kind of got lost in that middle school transition time. And I first started hearing about transition services when I was working on a listening committee here in town to figure out how to get information to parents. And when I first heard the word transition services, I just really didn't even know what that meant. What are we transitioning to? There's services after high school? I had no idea about that. And I felt that I had been pretty involved in her life and her IEPs and her school situation. and had no idea. And then I hear the word Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, and I'm thinking, now what is this? Vocational, to me, that means, wood shop. I graduated in the 80s. We still had shop then. So that's what went through my mind. And then I hear rehabilitation. I'm thinking, oh, there's something wrong with someone. They need to be rehabilitated. So seriously, those were my thoughts that I had. Of course, I had a lot to learn. And there was a lot of people in our community to help guide us through that. So back to her transition time, we really didn't start working on that until last year when we switched over to her new online school. And within that, we decided to have her transition services start with SWAP. So we're working with the School to Work Alliance program. And we also are in one of her IEP goals is having her work with a local community college with some of her media, which I'll explain on the next slide. Let's go ahead and go to that next slide, please. So Codi, I guess I should say what I should start out with is that when you have a child with special needs, you don't often hear people ask, so what is it that you want to be when they grow up? That's just not something that people look at when they see a little girl in a wheelchair. They don't think that she's going to be able to do something like some sort of employment. So that's kind of a sad way to continue on. But I think there's a lot of ways around that. And so right now, Codi's doing a lot of self-advocacy and self-determination work in her school. And prior to that, she hadn't really thought about those goals. She's always been very motivated, though. She's always been very creative. She's always been interested in being an entrepreneur. She one time decided to create a hotel because we had gotten stuck in Denver in a snowstorm, and the hotel we were staying at didn't actually have as much accessibility as we thought it did. So she took it upon herself to create a 100-room hotel, each room with a different theme and accessible to anyone. Her favorite part of that was the sideways elevator that would take everybody down to the playroom. So she started that in about 3rd grade, and her mind has just really worked incredibly well. But if you ask her what she wants to do when she graduates, she might say, I don't know. So these new discussions talking about self-advocacy and self-determination have been really good, but slightly uncomfortable for her. She's always been very good at advocating. We actually do a lot of public speaking at various conventions and in our local communities, talking about these sorts of topics and how we can get information out to other families. But also another thing she's learning about is how to talk about her disability. Now that she is a young not a young adult, but she's 16, that people ask questions. And in the past, it was always me kind of interfering with that. And I would say, oh, it's okay, we'll talk about this later, although we've always been pretty open. But now she can talk about it and say, hey, yeah, this is my communication device. This is part of me. This is my wheelchair. This is part of me. So that's been a really important part of discovering who she is. I think the last 3 speakers talked a lot about what supports do I need? And this is something that as a parent, to think of her going out into the workplace is a little bit scary because she definitely needs supported employment. She would need someone with her to help her maybe get into the building. How is she going to get there? Driving. She did some types of driving assessments, but because of her cerebral palsy and her lack of vision, she's not going to be able to drive, even though she really wants to. So looking at those supports physically for her, and then going out into our community and seeing where are there places that would have the supports that she would need. And thankfully places like DVR, the Division of Vocational Rehab, do have, if they are staffed up, they do have job coaches and people that can go with her into the workplace. Her interests and goals are things that she really likes to talk about. We've been really fortunate to be able to facilitate a lot of those interests and goals outside of the school setting. She does, work with code ninjas. She is just a tech whiz. Tech is so important in her life, and that'll be something important in her post-secondary world as well. However, talking about what Jennifer said, what are realistic expectations, although we set the bar fairly high for her, but she reads at a 2nd grade level, and also her math skills are about there, but she can code a game, no problem. So what kind of work environment is she going to fit the best in? Next slide, please. So she does a lot of volunteering in our community. A few years ago, we went to the KKCO, which is our local newscast system here, to meet the newscasters. And this is something that she thought about a lot. And she thought about on her own. So she wanted to go there just to meet the newscasters and see what it was like. And she's decided that she wants to be the first communication broadcaster to use a communication device. So that was her own goal, which is great. So she's taking a lot of media classes. She's learned a lot more about her iPad so that she can use it more efficiently. So maybe she'll be able to do that. The second picture there is her and her grandma, and they volunteer at the VA here in our local community. And that is actually going to be part of her SWAT programming, that she will get credits for that as she moves forward as well. And we also try to get her involved in a lot of other community events. The last picture there is her at a local farm, and she volunteers there and helps sells pumpkins and gives tours and things. So I think that's really important in her situation to have those volunteering types of things going on in her life and those events. For one, it helps her motivate to use her communication device on her own and be more independent without me being there to interpret for her. Next slide, please. These are just some things that we've thought out as we've gone on over the last few years, of things to think about as you are moving into post-secondary education or in the employment world, are things that you might want to think about when you're getting prepared for that. It could be anywhere from a screen magnifier to Codi gets really hot, which can create a seizure. So maybe modified area temperatures where she is at. Someone to help scribe ramps and lifts. Can they even get into the building? So you can look through those, and maybe some of those will spark some type of thoughts about when you're working with students, things that they might need as they're moving forward, period. Next slide, please. So I could talk, I have pages and pages of notes, but we're limited on time, but I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight on what it's like to have a child with severe disabilities who is actually a very, I don't know what the right word I want to say is, but she sets her goals, she gets there. So she doesn't look like the person that people may see her on paper. But also for parents to want to be able to feel confident and engage your student's team, to be able to say, hey, these are the people we need at our IEP. These are the goals that I want to set for my student. These are the goals that my student wants to set for them. And to realize those resources are out there. And as Bob has said, sometimes they may go up and down. Like 10 years ago, we did have this alliance here in our community, but now they're having to recreate it. And I can say there's some really good things going on because the conversations were started. And that's really important. So as a parent, I encourage others to say, hey, feel confident, ask questions, you know your child the best.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Bob and Gail. Great to sort of wrap us up, Jen, and share your story about Codi. She is so driven, so inspirational. So at this time, we're glad that we actually have time for questions. Sometimes you go right up to the end. So we would love to engage with you all if you have comments or questions. We're happy to stay on and answer them.
I have a quick question that I'll ask, and then if anyone wants to ask a question, either enter it in the chat and we can read it, or if you want to unmute and ask, that's fine too. We just have a couple of minutes. But I was just curious, Jen, on Codi's online school, is she able to do that on her own, or does she need support to do online school? And do you get support for her to do online school if needed?
Well, a little bit of both. She actually does have an online para. So her para is at her house and Codi's here at our house, and they work together. She goes to the online classes with Codi, whether they're gen ed or if they're in their SSN classes. Sometimes the kids are all working together and then they break off and do their own thing. They also have time where they meet up together to do homework for a couple hours during the day. So yeah, so from my aspect as a mom, I don't necessarily I get her all set up, but then she can log on herself and she does her school all by herself throughout the day, but her para is there and they are critical to the success of this program, or the paras for sure.
All right. And it looks like Holly had a question, but I think she thinks it's answered. If anyone else, I have one other quick question is, how would a family, if they're interested in getting hooked up with SWAP, do they just talk to their school transition team, or how does that happen? If
No, I would suggest if they're in high school that they talk to their case manager for their IEP. And just as a note, I don't think it's accurate to say every district in Colorado has a SWAP program. I don't think we can make that assumption, but many do. And if the case manager doesn't know, then they need to find out. If they're in a district that doesn't have SWAP, they might want to think about, what it would take to create that, because there's several, all the major districts have a SWAP program, but if you're in a rural area that might not have a SWAP program, you could have that could be a place to start the conversation. How do you help create that for the future? It's partially funded by DVR, so it's not the whole financial responsibility of a school district to create a SWAP program. So it's more taking advantage of some supports that are out there already.
Is the
My
eligibility-
recommendation is that they would connect with their local Division of Vocational Rehabilitation office. If there is no SWAP program within their district, SWAP is a vendor for DVR. And so that would be a good place to start, is with the local DVR office.
And Gail, is the eligibility the same for SWAP as it is for DVR, or is it a different?
So the student would need to be made eligible through DVR. DVR then decides what those services will look like.
Okay. All right, well, this is wonderful. Thank you guys all for this presentation. Does anyone have any final questions before we sign off? If not, just thank you all for your wonderful presentation. It's so great to hear all of your perspectives. And also, Jen, thank you for sharing your personal story. We really appreciate that. Again, we'll be sending out an evaluation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact Peak Parent Center. We have parent advisors available at parentadvisor@peakparent.org. And if you want to talk to anyone from the Project Power team, you can just call the main line or ask a parent advisor to connect you with the Project Power team, which is focused on transition. So on behalf of Peak Parent Center and our wonderful presenters, thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.